Jameson here to talk about the experience of CRC as well. So I think the way we're going to start is we're going to ask each of our three panelists just to talk a little bit about what your experience has been like in Jewish spaces. In particular, ask people of color what that experience has been like. So Tema, can we put you on the spot and have you start for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Gemar Tov to everyone. If you're fasting, I hope you're having a safe and meaningful fast. I will say that I just had my third dose of the COVID vaccine, and between that and my health conditions, you might see me drinking some water today. So I am with you in sort of the spirit of the day. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, which is my hometown. I am probably some of you may have read my writing and may know a little bit about my background, but I'm going to start sort of with a little bit of information on that and how I came to do the work that I do, which is my mother is a third generation Canadian Jewish woman. Her grandparents emigrated, one side as refugees, one side as immigrants from Poland and what is now probably somewhere in Romania, though we're not so clear on the refugee side how they got here. And my mom grew up in Toronto, actually down the street from where I live now, in sort of a typical but atypical Jewish multi-generational immigrant household. Yiddish was the first language in their home, and that was really her background. And when she was a young adult, she decided she wanted to study art in New York City. Moved really actually to explore, the Mecca of Jewish life, New York, and actually ended up meeting my father, who is not part of the Mecca of Jewish life at all. My father is from Staten Island, New York. His family is originally from the Bahamas, and my dad was born and raised in New York City. Young Black man coming up through. If you know New York at all, Staten Island is the one borough that typically votes Republican in New York City. It is the hotspot for COVID right now because people don't believe in the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite a conservative place and quite a white place. And so my dad grew up there through the 50s and 60s, one of very few Black families. They were very involved with the Catholic worker movement, and there was a major Catholic worker farm there. And so that was how they had ended up on Staten Island. My parents met. Being an interracial couple in New York City in the late 70s was not great. So they moved up to Toronto, not to say that Toronto was perfect, but very different, and had my brother and I here. So we grew up downtown in Toronto, not really having a whole lot to do with the Jewish community outside of when my grandparents would take us every Saturday into the Jewish neighborhoods of Toronto for lunch. We didn't have sort of traditional Jewish education, and I didn't have a bat mitzvah, nothing like that. And there were a whole bunch of reasons for it. Some of it were political mismatches between my sort of very leftist parents and a more conservative community. But a lot of it also was that as an interfaith, interracial family, people looked at us. People looked at us a lot and with judgment. The stories that I heard that fortunately I don't have memories of because I was quite young would be, people making comments that my grandfather would correct when we were out, wondering if my brother and I were adopted, things like that, especially my brother, who is darker than I am. And so it was a really uncomfortable place for us to be. I became really curious about Judaism when I was young, sort of self-taught about Jewish culture and identity beyond what we got in my family. But, my parents had decided we were going to be raised Jewish. We did holidays at home, things like that. And eventually, long story short, spent a year of grad school in Jerusalem. And most of my classmates were in rabbinical school, Jewish educator school, and also from the Reform movement in the US, which was very different than the Jewish community in my hometown. And so I got kind of enamored with the idea that there's like this vibrant community we could and should be building that I didn't even really realize was possible. Moved home, ended up leaving grad school, and I guess we're about 15 years later from that now. I get to work full-time doing that. My full-time job is working with Jewish communities, professionals, lay leaders, clergy, specifically on the issue of interfaith families. But of course, that has huge crossover with racial diversity in our community. And then in my spare time, I'm a consultant doing that work specifically around racial diversity and racism and anti-racism with mostly Jewish community spaces, and then I get to write about it. So it's really kind of magical seeing this come together, but it hasn't come easy, and I will say that it still is full of challenges and full of, while we have come a long way from the community I grew up in, there's still a lot of assumptions made, a lot of questions asked about like what people are doing by being in our community, questions asked about like, are we changing the nature of what it means to be Jewish by simply existing in our Jewish communal spaces? And that's challenging, and it's emotionally draining to be sort of working to say, no, like we've always been here. We just want to actually show up now. Like we want, this is, we want to show up without judgment. We want to show up and feel safe. So that's really a little bit of like the 30,000 foot view that I get by being a professional, but also very much what I feel on the ground. What I will say is, because I walk into Jewish spaces looking like this, I generally don't get overtly racist comments directed at me. But what I often get are the comments that people who don't know me and don't know my background would say if they thought that there was nobody Black or of African descent in the room. And that is a unique kind of challenge because, the things that I hear often are the things that people know that they shouldn't be saying in polite company. And so that's been an interesting set of challenges for me. And a lot of assumptions get made when people do find out, that I come from an interfaith family or that my father's Black, about my politics or whatever it might be. And I face that pretty much constantly, especially now that my name is very identified with my identity. So I can talk about this for like weeks, and I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to pass it off. I don't know whoever wants to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tari. I feel like a lot of folks that might know my background. I was born in Harare, Zimbabwe, and I moved to the US when I was 9. And then from then on, that's where my Jewish identity sort of started. My dad is an Israeli Jew and my mom is Zimbabwean. And then my interests actually are rooted in identity and behavior. And then that sort of just trickles into my other passions of like justice and racial justice work. And my experience in American Jewish institutions and spaces is complex, and I don't think that is unique to just me. And I think the complexity is layered in that when you're like waking up or becoming conscious of the way that this country works, you sort of become aware of the concessions that you've had to make in order to fit into these spaces. So and that is a process of grief. That is a process of questions that you sort of have to face yourself about, like why you had to make those concessions without actually being conscious of them. So wanting to belong because you want to be part of the community and these are your people, and also because of I guess, anti-Black racism and colorism, needing to belong sometimes because you also want to feel like you have this backing of an institution that you can say, okay, I am Jewish because I belong here. And so those are like the things that you sort of have to navigate. And of course, institutions are not perfect and there's a lot of harm, but there's also a lot of joy. So it's sort of navigating how to hold both of them. And that's where my complexity with that stands. I'll pass it over.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juan Jamison. I guess I was a full adult when I came to Judaism. So I'm listening to my co-panelists, and I guess I didn't have those issues of growing up in a Jewish space and having to deal or having to wrestle with being accepted or feeling comfortable in those spaces. By the time I came here, I had plenty of experience being maybe the only Black person in certain educational spaces, certain workspaces. So to show up at CRC and be one of the only Black people in any given space was, for lack of a better word, par for the course. So I didn't have those concerns. And then also, as I discussed a week ago, I believe with Rabbi Daniel, CRC here in St. Louis, and the other Jewish congregation that I've had some experience with, Base Abraham, they're not perfect, but they are unique. So the vast majority of my experience has been what I would classify as pleasant. It hasn't been awkward. I don't assume any more awkward than it would be for me to show up in a given space on a Saturday morning or a Sunday afternoon or whatever the case may be. A little bit about my familial background. Like I said, I wasn't born Jewish. Mother and father were both Baptists. So I grew up pretty much Baptist. Before I came to CRC, I went through a kind of, I guess, awakening out of high school where I became very questioning and challenging toward Christianity. And at that time, I got exposed to Islam, the Nation of Islam specifically, and then traditional Islam. I ended up, spending more time traditionally around Muslims and what we would call mainstream Islam. So, and that's kind of what led me here to CRC, was wanting to learn and be exposed to different things. So actually, I'm here because of Facebook. One day I saw an ad for a course called Intro to Judaism. And me being me, I chose CRC because it was closest to the city. I had never heard of it, didn't know anything about it, but I figured, okay, I'll give it a try, and came a series of classes every week for like a month and a half. And I met Maggie Dewey. She was the facilitator. And when the course ended, she invited me to come out to visit the congregation. And in my typical fashion, it took me like 2.5 months to do that. But when I did show up, I remember seeing Rabbi Randy walk down the aisle headed toward the Bema. And at that moment, no one could not convince me that that was David from the Bible. I remember laughing because I knew it wasn't David, but I was like, oh my God, that looks like David. But I said, that's gotta be David from the Bible. And I stayed, I guess it was a bar bat mitzvah that day. And I stayed, and I've been coming back ever since. And that journey went from me being a visitor to eventually becoming a member. At one point, I was asked would I consider serving on the board. I said yes. So now I'm a board member currently here at CRC. And my biggest experience with Judaism, or the thing about coming here and about Judaism that I love the most, is the rhythm of the cycle and the opportunity to learn, to immerse yourself in different courses and classes, and the structure and the history of the books and everything. So yeah, that's kind of a little brief introduction to my background, what brought me here. And I'll move on. See you there. Oh, and I apologize for drinking coffee to anyone who is fasting. I'm fasting, but yeah, I needed something. It's been a little bit. So
I can empathize with that very much. Great. So I want to switch modes a little bit and sort of kick off the conversation around the study that just came out by the Jews of Color Initiative. And, you know, there's so much in there that we can talk about. And I mean, first, I just want to sort of open up by saying that, you know, this is, for me, it was really thrilling to have this study done by like leading academics in the field, because for years Jews of color have been saying like, hey, we're here, and you all think you know a lot about us, you all think you understand our experiences, but actually no one's really studied this. And you know, it's one thing to have anecdotes to point to, it's a different thing to have research to point to. So for me as a professional, it's been a game, or I'm hoping it is a game changer. But that really, sorry, I just kicked a dog. Oops. I've got two dogs. One of them will probably make an appearance. But for me, that's been really huge. And what I think was remarkable to me was that the study said what all the anecdotes had been saying, which for those of us who live in the community was not a surprise. But for the people who had been reluctant to listen, might have come as a little bit of a surprise. And now we had some quantifiable observations about the experiences of Jews of color in our community. So just for anyone who hasn't read the study, I just want to like frame a couple of high level things and then dive into conversation. And really, I'm sure I'm going to leave out something that is huge. So feel free to jump in with other observations. But for me, the big ones were that there's often an assumption made that if you are a Jew of color, that you have converted. Of the people who responded to the survey, it was over 60% were born to one or two Jewish parents. The largest group of respondents in the survey were born to one Jewish parent, 41 or 2%, I believe, which for me, sorry, dog chaos, for me was really reinforced something that I had long thought as somebody who works with interfaith families, that when you can't talk about one without talking about the other. And so that was a huge observation, and the sad conclusion that over 80% had faced racism in Jewish spaces. There was also a lot in there around how people experience their Judaism, and I think something that Tari said that you know was borne out in the study is that it was a great source of joy for the majority of people, whether they face challenges in communal space or not, and that people were very eager to look for ways to live out all parts of their culture. They weren't Jewish in Jewish space, and whatever their other identities, racial identities might be in other spaces, that they were always fully themselves and looking for ways to integrate that very often. Did I miss anything that either of you want to sort of throw in for what the key conclusions were?
I think you got it. Yeah.
Awesome. I tried to reread the whole thing today, but like I said, COVID vaccine, not feeling really on top of my game right now. Really, I think the first thing that I'd love for each of us to reflect on, I've sort of said a little bit my thoughts here, but how did you feel when the study came out? Like, was it affirming? Was it something that really got you thinking about your own identity, your relationship to your multiple identities? Like, what were your initial reactions to this? Yeah, Tari, do you want to? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not privy to everything that was in the study that you're citing, but issues that African Americans the things that they said they experienced wouldn't be a surprise to me at all, because in America, anytime you are in a space that is not predominantly Black, you're going to experience, you're going to have those kind of experiences that can range anywhere from, if you're lucky, pleasant, to the worst extreme, which is something that is very unpleasant. Most of the time, what I've experienced is a kind of, you kind of get the friendly Caucasian syndrome where they'll ask you, so do you know where you are? Or, like, why are you here? And sometimes, it's just any one particular person being helpful. But where it stands out is you don't see those questions extended to other people. So then you're like, okay, well, obviously, this is whatever you're seeing, whatever you're interpreting my presence being here, quote unquote, out of the norm, that's that reality. So, and like I said, in America, you're going to get those experiences. I guess maybe, and this is now maybe me reflecting more personally, after a while, it almost becomes like background noise, because you can't go around constantly dwelling on those things, even though you wish you lived in a space where you were spared those types of interactions, whatever they may be. Microaggressions, I think a couple of years ago the term came out, and those are definitely the things that you encounter. So to be in a Jewish space, it's like to be in any space, you're definitely going to subject yourself to those types of experiences. So.
Definitely hear that. Research, for me, my initial reaction, research studies like this are always really fascinating to me. One, because this is information that is sort of well known and communicated across already. But the fact that in order for it to be valid, sometimes in order for it to be taken seriously, that it has to be turned into some larger than life study, you have like a mixed reaction to it, because you're like, oh, good, it's on paper, it's real, you can sort of pass this out. And also it's like, folks have been sharing these experiences for a really long time. And so that was my initial, grateful that the research study exists and it's present. And also holding this other part of like, wow, this really sucks that you sort of have to constantly prove your existence matters in this way, academically, for it to be taken seriously. And then the other part was also just validating in that you're not alone. Like, you're seeing all of these other respondents saying the exact same things that you're saying or that you've been struggling with. And it also helps you name things, which is really important. Like the section on double consciousness is a very real experience for me. Again, also not unique to me alone, but that in itself of how you have to learn how to like navigate power systems so well. And then you are in these rooms where these other folks don't have to learn you at all. And that's hard too. So it's that both and place where that was my reaction to it.
Yeah, I think both of you characterize things that I felt really deeply about it too. Was, I've been doing like small studies of Jews of color for years and years and years, and those observations are things that have been shared. And the people who were inclined to believe that there's racism in our spaces, that Jews of color are authentically Jewish and express their Jewish identity fully, that it's important to them, et cetera, all of course reacted to the study like, yeah, thanks, like we already knew. But at the same time, like, there was just this like deep feeling of like, oh, maybe the people who haven't listened to all of us telling like, hey, like, this is what we're hearing on the street, this is what we're hearing, in the affinity groups that you have so kindly set up, that these are the experiences that people are having. And it is simultaneously encouraging and disconcerting. One thing I also just want to throw out is that because I guess I get a lot of sort of social media world push back on these things. And what was really depressing to me was that, instantly sort of the usual suspects went for the methodology, that this wasn't because of the way that the sampling was done, it wasn't a valid study, which like, they literally wanted it to be random sampling, which when you think about the population, you can't even really do random sampling for something like the Pew study that has a multi-million-dollar budget. So finding a population of Jews of color within already a tiny proportion of the US Jewish community, it's not like there's a list of Jews that then you can call to collect a random sample of Jews of color. You would have to do it through the entire US population, would be impossible. So those were the moments where I was just like, no, like literally these people are saying that no matter what is done, they will always find a reason to reject it. And that was depressing and unsurprising, but also, just showed me the kind of work that needs to be happening, not by the people who this group will dismiss out of hand. And it's sort of a more conservative group of people, like politically conservative group of people, of course. But I think the people who they're inclined to dismiss out of hand are the people like me who have been doing the advocacy work all along, who are going to point to this and show the logic flaw in what they're asking for. And so that's when I think when we think about like allies and the people in the community who are there sort of working for inclusion, those are the places where people need to be stepping up and saying like, what will you listen to? When it's anecdotes, you won't listen. When it's research done by Stanford social scientists, you won't listen. Like, so what will you listen to? And really sort of pointing out the flaws in their approach there, because unfortunately that does gain purchase in Jewish community spaces. I heard people echoing that, surprising people echoing, well, it wasn't really a random sample, so it was self-selecting. So of course, if it's self-selecting, you're going to get Jews of color who are more inclined to talk about racism, and therefore that 80% statistic isn't real. And I'm like, that's just not correct. But one more thing that I just want to lift up is this idea of the what did you call it? Like the polite Caucasian syndrome, something like that. Yeah. It's like a story that's always stuck with me is somebody who I know who was a communal leader who happens to be a young Black man, had walked into a synagogue that had just hired a Black rabbi, and that rabbi hadn't started yet. And it was Shabbat morning. He had gone to check out the congregation. And by the time he even got into the sanctuary, 3 people had told him that they had hired a Black rabbi. And he was like, why did you feel the need to approach me to tell me this? And that's not even the like, what are you doing here? That's sort of like the sort of, or like, can I help you figure out how to be in this space? That goes like one step further to like, we're going to tell you how inclusive we are while also singling you out as somebody Black in a really uncomfortable way when you're just here to go to Shabbat services. And so it's tricky because I think sometimes our inclination is to overcorrect, which has unfortunately a similar singling out impact. And I think some of that was borne out in the study as well.
It's funny to pick up on what you just said, because I noticed that like after the recent George Floyd situation, there was a renewed push among people to kind of like make sure that African Americans were present in their organizations, present in their meetings, and while it was I didn't quite know how to take that, because while inclusion is always a good thing, if it seems too forced, then at some point it's like it's like trying too hard, to me, you just, and the thing that most people I think don't understand about Black people, okay, I'm gonna be arrogant enough to speak on behalf of Black people right now, is that all you really want is to just be allowed to be in a space. That's it. We don't need you to be extra welcoming. You don't have to go out of your way. We don't need to know how many Black friends you have. It just allow Black people to be in your space. If they want to stay in your space, they will stay. If they don't, they won't. I'm living proof of that from both sides. And that is, and that's tricky. That's really hard. Just like when you were speaking about what more evidence does the community or a community need to actually start listening to the Jews of color amongst them, you're going to always run into the, I want to say cognitive dissonance, but I want to make sure I'm not trying to use terms and miss the point of what I'm trying to communicate. People like to believe that their structures, the world around them, is at a certain level of inclusion. And anytime they get evidence, information that calls that into question, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get, it's going to get challenged because they're made to feel uncomfortable now. The level of awareness, achievement, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, that they believe was achieved, maybe not so much. And nothing to me highlighted that more than the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, so yeah, you're going to always get pushback, or you're going to have trouble getting people to accept those kind of things, because at that moment, maybe things that they've ignored or that they wanted to ignore or tried to ignore, that makes it harder to do so. So when you especially when you start to meet people's real world experience and then data bagging those real world experiences up, you're going to have that disconnect. And people are going to keep that disconnect up as long as they can, basically as long as they can. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, it's something that I think about a lot. Because of my work as a consultant, I often am called into spaces to advise them on how to get more Black Jews at the table or something like that. And, that predates George Floyd, but has accelerated rapidly in the post George Floyd era, let's call it that. And, my response is always like, this isn't a 1-year process. This is a 10-year process. This is about looking at why they weren't at the table. This is looking at what you need to do to become a space. This is also needing to find out, are there Black Jews in your community, right? And I think the answer is not always yes, but everyone wants to find the magical person. I get calls all the time. Do you know somebody to be on my board? I'm like, me sitting in Toronto does not know somebody. I mean, I might know somebody, but that's not actually doing the work that you need to do to become inclusive. That's looking for somebody to sit at your table because it looks good. So one thing I just want to address a question that came in the chat. A question came into us that, are there any Black Jews who don't believe that racism is an issue, specifically referring to the point I mentioned about the self-selected study? And the answer is yes, 100%. There are people who have publicly written about that. There are people who have outwardly rejected the idea that there's any such thing as a Jew of color, that, we're all just Jews, and therefore, sort of a colorblind approach to Jewish identity, and everything in between. And in the study itself, 80% of people said that they experience racism in Jewish spaces, and 20% said no. It might be like 82 and 18, but something in that ballpark. So even within the study, there are a significant chunk who say that they haven't experienced racism in Jewish space. And I don't know if they asked a question directly. I can't remember off the top of my head of, do you believe racism is a problem in Jewish space? I don't think they asked that question. But there absolutely are. The reaction I largely saw to that, 18 to 20% of people who said that they hadn't experienced racism in Jewish spaces was like a fairly incredulous, really? But, you know, obviously there might be spaces where people haven't experienced it. I personally have a slightly hard time believing that, because it's not just like coming from leadership. It's, you know, I always say your community is only as inclusive as its most racist member, because all it takes is that one interaction to send somebody somewhere else. So it's a complicated issue. And you know, like one of the biggest things that I really hope people actually take from the study is that Jews of color, Black Jews, you know, Jews of various racial and ethnic backgrounds are not a monolith. And that's been, I think, a really big thing. So I'll use a personal example. I talk almost never publicly about my Israel politics, almost never. I have been called an anti-Zionist and an anti-Semite and a self-hater over Israel stuff repeatedly. I have been mistaken for a very vocal mixed race Jew who's involved in Jewish Voice for Peace repeatedly. And I'm like, I was like a synagogue employee at a like large Reform congregation in Canada, who very consciously does not talk about my Israel politics because it's not germane to the work that I want to be doing in our community. And I think, you know, the assumption was because I'm a mixed race Jew who talks about race and racism in the United States and in Canada, therefore I'm an anti-Zionist, which is trying to paint sort of a monolithic identity. And I think, you know, what my actual politics are actually not germane here. But the fact that people thought that they knew them just based on my identity, I think is very telling. I don't know if either of you have ever faced things like that, where people just assume that they know what you believe about something because of who you are.
There was yes, yes. There was a training that me and Dr. Koach did maybe a month ago, or not a month ago, like 3 months ago, at a federation where we were doing a racism 101 or intersectionality 101 teaching. And in it, we wanted to like document where intersectionality comes from. And we were rooting it in like Black women or Black feminist theory. And that's like talking about Audre Lorde, it's talking about Bell Hooks, it's talking about like Kimberly Crenshaw and Angela Davis. And on the slide, we posted a picture of all of these women on there. And without stating making any political statement other than that, intersectionality is rooted from the history of folks like this. And when we were about to present, we like shared all of the slides, and we were told that we had to delete that slide specifically because of the presence of Angela Davis on that slide, regardless of whether or not we were making a statement about anything that Dr. Davis has ever said. And it was also, yeah, so that was a moment where you sort of have to sit there and be like, all right, so I want to share about intersectionality because this is important to understand Jews of color and Black Jews. And also now you're placing other things on the moment that should not be placed. So it was definitely, yeah, it was an interesting moment.
For me personally, I haven't had too many issues like that politically. Most of the time, I'm in group settings where most of the people are Democratic or at least left-leaning, and a lot of my positions are also that way. There are a few things where I do differ, and usually to keep the peace, I'll keep those things to myself personally. But one thing where I will speak up on is, or like I can share it now, I am, a lot of the people that I'm around are anti-gun and are actively or involved in anti-gun initiatives. And myself personally, I am not anti-gun. And if anything, I encourage gun ownership amongst African Americans. that I keep to myself most of the time, because and I'll be honest, I don't quite think we're in the America where that is not a reality or a concept that should not be considered by African Americans, especially African Americans with families. That being said, I will participate in your anti-gun activities. I will support them. But I, especially when it comes to, making neighborhoods safer, I am all a fan of that. But I'm not going to be a hypocrite and not say that me and other like-minded African American friends that I have, that we're not avid gun owners. We're not avid proponents of the Second Amendment. And so, and that's just one example. There's been other examples. Because again, like I said, my background, having been born in a Black family in the city of St. Louis, Baptist, I am influenced by those beliefs. I am influenced by that culture. As a person who still lives in an area that some may consider to be economically challenged, areas that can be impacted, from a crime impacted area. Me, more than anyone, is highly sensitive to those issues. Yet, the thing that I think people forget sometimes, and the thing that I definitely think is being forgotten in today's climate, is that a lot of things are not black and white. And pardon the pun. There are levels of gray, there are levels of complexity to any issue. And again, I think that's something that, being an African American, a person of color, that's something that I think sometimes we get denied as well, that we're not seen, or it's not immediately considered that we might have opinions or views, that have a range. They're not all going to always be in lockstep with what the greater society perceives our beliefs should be. So yeah, that's kind of been my political experience. As far as being Black and Jewish and a Jew of color in Israel, I'll be honest, I'm not, I guess by me not being born Jewish, Israel doesn't impact, Israel isn't as big an issue for me as it might be for obviously other Jews that I encounter. I'm aware of Israel, obviously, and the things that are going on there, but it's not something that I invest any significant energy into on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I live in the city of St. Louis. I live in the state of Missouri. Those are much more relevant, impactful situations to me than Israel and unfortunately, whatever issues that they are dealing with, good and bad. So.
I have to throw the requisite Canadian, super Canadian joke. I'm like, the second guns come up, I'm like, oh, I am so Canadian. It is very funny. I mean, I don't think it helps that also my dad is from New York City, which is not exactly a city that is super, anyhow. So it's very funny sort of remembering the geographic differences. And when we talk about there is no monolithic identity, right? Geographic differences and where you grew up, play a pretty significant role in politics, no matter your racial or religious identity. And I think that's really key to remember. I want to make sure that we have time to take questions from people watching, whether there or online. So maybe what we should do now is just do sort of one go around with any sort of concluding thoughts, and then use the time that we have left together to talk a little bit about basically racial justice inclusion work that's going on in your community, and also answer questions from people who are watching today. Tari, do you want to kick off with some preliminarily concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that we're building and repairing at the same time. So like, it's really great to build conversations and have spaces like this, but also I think the repair could be inserting Jews, like what both of y'all talked about earlier, inserting Jews into spaces that are not solely rooted in talking about justice and activism like this. So it doesn't feel as tokenizing or performative at times. So that's what I have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that really quick and just say that, you know, one of the biggest things people ask me of, you know, what my vision of a racially inclusive Jewish community is like, I'm out of work. Right? Like, I just want to show up and like know that things are inclusive, and that racism has been dealt with to a point that it's not what we have to talk about. And I think, you know, just sort of building on that, one more step is like, I don't remember which of the two of you said, like, just want to be, like, we just want to be. And, you know, I think we've come a long way when, you know, you show up and it's Black Jews are teaching Torah, not talking about racism.
Well, one thing I definitely have to highlight is, again, any change will definitely come from the people, or the best change should come from the people who make up a community. So, and as an example of that here, and it was kind of the outgrowth of our last Yom Kippur sessions, these outbreak sessions, is we formed a diversity committee here, which I happen to be a member of, and which I am so glad the opportunity was created for me to speak on, because I probably would have been severely chastised had I not mentioned it. But our community here is striving toward, and this can be led by this community, or that particular Havara is striving to help make CRC a more diverse, a more comfortable community for all members, and you know, the people of color, whatever your particular ethnic background, racial background may be. And one of the best things we can do is try to focus on raising awareness, raising sensitivity to the people in our community, and making sure that when we engage with them, when we interact with them, that that we're doing that from a good place, and a place that will be that will create a positive experience for everyone involved. So I didn't want to say that while we had time.
Awesome. Yeah, some of the questions that just came in were specifically about what's going on at CRC. So I think you spoke to that very clearly. And for anyone who wants to learn more, I would say you know, contact the synagogue, and they'll get you sort of hooked up with more information on how you can be involved in that. So just going to look and see. You can throw questions into the Q&A. You can throw them into the chat. I'm trying to sort of go back and forth, and I know that we also have Rabbi Bogart is also watching, and he'll flag anything for me. But one is a question of terminology. So Steve's, I'm going to pronounce your last name wrong, probably. I'm sorry. Skranka asks, Tari, can you please explain double consciousness?
Yeah. So it is where the folks who are oppressed have to be aware of the two worlds that they live in. So they are aware of the oppressor's world, and understand how they function and they live, and they understand their power systems and their structures, while also understanding the fact that they are marginalized and oppressed, and they have to function in that system. So you're living in two different realities, and you have to manage both of them. I think if anyone has anything to add on that, that could.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I want to add to that is that, the one of the things that's been really grating on me lately is the misuse of the term woke to be something negative. When woke originally came as a term, it came out of African American vernacular English to mean double consciousness, to mean sort of an awareness of the societal structures that you live in. And if you were woke, or if you got woke, it was that you understood racism, that you understood, how society functioned in ways that made it harder. Essentially, it was about structural racism, right? And it was about understanding structural racism. Now, unfortunately, it is used mostly sarcastically, either to mean like an uber liberal white person, or just negatively to mean like somehow undermining the world order. And I'm seeing too much of that in Jewish space. There was a question about finding the study. I will throw a link to that into the chat, so stand by. So the next question that came in that I think is really great here is, what do you want from the leaders of Jewish institutions to improve their communities or organizations for us and other Jews of color? So do you all want to jump in on that?
Well, I would say that, I hope this is addressing the question. If not, I apologize. But one thing I will say that needs to be done is there seems to have been quite a bit of work focused on talking to people of color, in this particular case, Jews of color, et cetera, about their experiences, what they're going through, what they've encountered. To me, those kind of types of conversations now need to move toward the larger community at hand, because it's like when there's political time and the politician comes and he speaks to the Black church, or when there's an issue about some racial issue and they come and speak to audiences of Black people. That's fine and good. But at some point in time, you need to also speak to the audiences of predominantly European Americans, white Americans, whatever particular racial descriptive term is applied. But take these findings, these lessons, this information, take it to those audiences and share it with those audiences. If you are concerned about authenticity, take along certain representatives of the community. These two lovely ladies that are on this panel with me today would be fine examples of people who could be, resources of knowledge and learning. But the conversation needs to shift from talking to people of color about the issues of people of color into talking to the people that the folks of color have the issues with. Because I don't know how many more times you can discuss those issues with the people in that community. It's time to take those issues and take them to the broader community. So, in your communities, if you identify a certain number of Jews of color, people of color in your congregations, your synagogues, et cetera, and you talk to them and you dialogue with them, and you open up avenues of communication, at some point in time, if they do bring you issues, then those issues need to be taken to the community at large, and definitely discuss with them so that people can't continue to be surprised at the findings that they come across or the results of what, yet again, is the latest study or the newest study or whatever. So that's kind of what I would have to say on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do a lot of research around educational spaces and classrooms. And one of my main beliefs is that education is like this pathway, or the classroom is a critical place where liberation can happen. And I think a lot with American Jewish spaces is that if there's a focus on Hebrew schools or Jewish schooling where we are teaching children's like critical thinking skills or like teaching histories that public education or just schooling in general doesn't do as well because of bureaucracy and policy. If that can be implemented in Jewish educational systems, I think that would be really great. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything said. And, you know, one thing I'll also add is just, you know, some of the, and this is the diversity consultant in me speaking, but some of this is also making sure that you have policies for what happens if something racist happens. What happens if somebody comes to you and says, you know, I had this horrible run-in with somebody on Shabbat at the Oneg, and they said this horrible thing to me. Like, what do you do to address it? And I think a lot of the time, first of all, half of the time you don't actually get that report because people don't know how to tell you that it's happened, or people don't feel comfortable telling you that it's happened, or people don't want to put you into an uncomfortable place by telling you that it's happened, and like people just swallow it. I've done that. Like, I will be explicit that I've done that. And some of those encounters might also be happening in situations with I don't want to call them power differentials, but I will, where, you know, it's a donor and a facility staffer or something like that. So there's these sorts of pieces where things are happening, and it plays into larger patterns that make it more complicated to address. So making sure that you've created the kinds of policies that other organizations have to address these issues when they come up. And I think another thing is also you know, the role of leadership in teaching what the values of the community are, and in normalizing the fact that you know, racism has happened here, and pieces like that are just going to make it clear to people that this isn't a taboo topic in any way, shape, or form. We're not talking about something that happens over there. One thing that I've often remarked on is that the Jewish community, and, you know, I don't know your congregation intimately. I just sort of know the reputation of your congregation. So I'm not talking specifically about you all, but many congregations that I speak to have done a really wonderful job of showing up for racial justice for other people, right? It's like, oh, we have a Black church that we partner with down the street, and we show up for the issues that they say, you know, is important to them, and we lobby and we write letters and we go to protests, and then they ask the question, they're like, why are there no Jews of color in our space? And so we need to be better at looking at issues of race inside our communities, rather than just treating it as like we are the good guys in the story of the fight against racial justice. So I think that's a major challenge of our community right now, is to be able to do that inward look, which is not easy. And this actually sort of dovetails with a question that came in to the Q&A that I think we spoke a little bit about earlier, but I think I want to answer it. I want us to answer it very explicitly. So the question is, one issue I've had in liberal Jewish spaces is white folks treating Black folks almost like a mascot. They seem to be interacting with them in a positive way to make themselves feel bigger, sort of like, oh, look at me, look how inclusive I am. And the person asking the question says, it makes me extremely uncomfortable, but I'm not sure how to address it. Ideas, and then in brackets, P.S. I'm white. So how would we like people to address sort of that patronizing way of interacting with Black folk in Jewish spaces? It's a big question, and we only have 7 minutes left, so. Anyone?
Well, I guess I'll get it going. One thing that I try to work off of is, and this may seem a little weird, but energy and intent. So when someone says something that might fall into that kind of category, if I think that there is sincerity behind what they say, then I most likely I might not respond to it. If I think that if the energy I sense from what was said is anything negative or less than positive, then at that particular situation, I probably would address it. And I'm not gonna lie, I'll probably address it in whatever manner would seem appropriate to me at the time, because I operate off the theory of, at some point in time, that type of thing needs to be challenged. So if I challenge it at that moment, then maybe I can prevent that individual from doing it again to someone, or at least doing it reflexively without considering, without considering what they're doing. It make them more aware, more present, more conscious of where they are and the spaces in which they're functioning and interacting with other people. So I'll be honest, I'm a huge user of sarcasm. And so, and particularly, I would probably respond with something to try to make that person think, to try to get them to be aware of like what they just asked me or what they just said to me. And, and hopefully that'll begin the process of changing that, correcting that. If I believe you said the person who wrote the question was white, if they see that behavior being done to the people of color in their community, then they feel so comfortable, there's nothing wrong with them talking to that person privately and trying to educate them, enlighten them on their behavior, what they did, why it's inappropriate. Because sometimes some people, I've been in situations where people say stuff because they don't know. And then I've been in situations where people say stuff and they say it under the guise of not knowing. And in those scenarios, when I detected that energy or that spirit, then I challenged everything they said till they got to the point where, and usually in short, they stopped saying things to me, which sometimes is a desired outcome. So yeah, but I definitely think that those things have to be confronted, especially if you feel if those interactions make you feel anything less than special, to use a cliche, then yeah, they kind of need to be addressed. So, and that's kind of how I would go about addressing it. So.
Yeah, I think, the key terminology for me here is always like getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think a lot of us don't want to confront people because it feels uncomfortable to us. I put myself, by the way, like I am guilty of this, and I am somebody who does this professionally. I am guilty of being like, ooh, I don't know how to handle this in the moment. Like it is very hard. And it is very, very hard. So I just want to name that like being uncomfortable confronting someone is sometimes just part of our personalities. And yes, the person who asked the question just wants to say, I feel a responsibility to do something since I'm the white person in the space, but it's hard to tell people to stop being positive. So I actually do have something for that one, which is just I think it's reframing a little bit what they're doing is like, it's so great that you're trying to be welcoming and inclusive. And I'm so glad that like, this is important to you and like racial justice is important to you and inclusion is important to you, but like, just put yourself into the shoes of the person who's being singled out right now. Right. And so it's not about like their intention, because obviously their intention is good. It's just about the impact of what they're doing, right? So it's that intent versus impact thing. Is no one wants to feel singled out. How would you feel if every time you walked into a room, somebody made a point of pointing out how many people like you they knew? And I think once people can sort of conceptualize that makes it a little bit easier. That to have that conversation is a lot of the time, I think it's just a bit of a failure of empathy, right? It's like you don't necessarily put yourself in the other person's shoes until somebody forces you to. So learning how to do that. We have literally like 2 minutes left. So I'm going to look for a final question and maybe what I'm going to try and do is combine what is left here. So Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of the comments that came in because I think they're important just to bring out and things that we didn't have time to talk about. Somebody mentioned in the chat, learning more about diversity of the Jewish diaspora, incorporating more traditions outside of sort of an Ashkenormative frame. Could create more inclusive space and more open-minded members. So asking ourselves, what are Jewish songs? What does a Jew look like? What languages do Jews speak? What do Jews eat or wear? Don't assume when somebody walks into your synagogue that you can tell whether they're Jewish or not based on any of the above, but also don't come out of the gate interrogating people about their differences. I think that's all super bang on. So I just wanted to read that out because I think that is huge. And the flip side of it is like not assuming that Jews of color are not Ashkenazi. Like, I'm going to break the fast today with bagels and cream cheese and lox with my Ashkenazi mom. Like, and that is the story of many of us. I would say that most of my sort of circle of mixed race Jewish friends are all Ashkenazi. So just, putting that out there as well is that we also make assumptions the other way. And I hear Ashkenormativity as a stand-in for racism a lot, and that's just not quite accurate. Somebody else threw in the chat how do other groups feel and how they would address these questions and what they would wish to see. Read the study. It talks a little bit about some of that. And I think one of the biggest things, sorry, I'm just like talking as I go through the chat. But, I think one of the biggest things, another question I saw is like, what did the study not cover? And I think that's a big one, right? Is that we don't actually understand the nuance within communities of color. Everyone sort of acknowledges that the term Jews of color is a stand-in for a huge number of racialized groups. It's not like that we all have one identity. And even within Black Jewish identities, there's a range. Like I said, like my Black Jewish identity is having one Ashkenazi Jewish parent and one Black parent who isn't Jewish. That is going to be a very different identity than somebody who is born to two Black parents, or somebody who is Black who was adopted by two white Jewish parents, and like everything in between, right? We're talking about a huge group of people. So I would love to see more research breaking down the more particularities of Jewish identity. I don't know if Tari, you have any conclusion or anything sort of on that front to think that you'd love to see more research into, because I know you're reading the research too.
No, I just want to echo your point about the breakdowns of the different forms of identity. I agree with that.
Awesome. I wish that we could talk forever, but unfortunately we can't. So I am going to unfortunately have to call this to a close. It's been such a pleasure being with you all. I am so glad to be able to sort of parachute into faraway communities. I've been in your city once before the pandemic, and I hope to make it back again. And maybe one day down the line, I will get to meet you all in person. Yes.
So Tema and Tari and Juan, thank you. And those of us who are here in person, I think are going to literally continue the conversation right now here in the tent. And those who are joining online, this is a conversation that's ongoing, and we'd encourage you to take part in CRC's Racial Justice Chavurah, which is really a group that starts from the premise that change has to start within our building before it starts anywhere else. So thank you all. Thank you so much. And Gemar Chatima Tova.
Bye, all. Gemar Chatima Tova.